2BC. Thank you so much for joining me today. We are in our last 2 weeks of our study of Job. And so today we're going to be taking a look at Job 40. Let's pray as we get started. God, I thank you so much for today. And I thank you that we get to continue to gather together and open your word, even across distances. And I pray, God, that as we read your word today, that you will open our hearts to what it is you want to say to us, and that you will bring understanding to our hearts, God. We love you. We pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. So as I said, we're going to be in Job 40 today, and really we're going to be in a larger part than just Job 40, because we've reached the part in Job where God finally speaks. Job has been asking for God to speak, wanting to have this interaction, this almost lawsuit type of interaction with God. And God is going to finally speak up. And that starts in Job 38. And so last week we left off with Elihu's speeches. We talked through that entire chunk that was leading up to God speaking. And then in chapter 38, God is going to finally speak. And God is going to speak to Job out of this storm or a tempest. And he's going to say a bunch of things to Job. And Job isn't going to say very much. So as far as the structure goes, God's going to speak in, starts in Job 38, verse 1. And he is going to speak all the way to the end of Job 41. So when we're thinking about God's speech, really, we can think of it as two speeches, and with Job having a very short response after each one. So our passage today is going to start with Job's response to God's first speech, and then the first part of God's second speech. But we're going to talk a little bit more broadly about what God has to say before we get there. And so we have God's first speech starts in 38:1, and it goes through 40 verse 2. And then we get Job's response, and then it picks back up in 40 verse 6 and goes all the way through the end of chapter 41. And then Job will respond in chapter 42, and we'll take a look at his response next week. But for today, I thought it'd be helpful if we kind of talked through kind of what God had to say and how he spoke to Job. And then we'll take a look specifically at Job 40 verses 1 through 14 and talk a little bit about what our curriculum covers for this week. So here we have at the beginning of Job 38, God begins to speak. And he speaks to Job out of the storm. Verse 1 says just that. The Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. And he bursts into all of this ongoing discourse and launches straight in. And we see God showing up on his own time. He's not showing up all the different times that Job has been demanding and requesting. He shows up on his own time, at his own appointed time. God can't be manipulated and coerced into doing what we want him to. He's going to act on his own time. But he does act, and he does show up, and he does speak to Job, which says a lot about God's relationship with Job and his care for Job, is that he is going to show up and he is going to speak and he is going to address a lot of what Job was concerned with, though he doesn't really address, okay, you said this and now I say this. It's more of God's going to speak, and it's going to address what Job has to say, just not on a one-for-one basis. So he's not directly answering, but he is answering. And this helps us understand that God's not correcting some sort of wrongdoing or sin on Job's part. It's more that God is coming into the scene and he's helping Job see with a fuller perspective, and also helping Job see that the line of thinking that he was on was headed in the wrong direction. And we'll talk more about that a little bit when we get to chapter 40. But in the beginning of God's speech, he starts off and he says, "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you and you shall answer me." And we will see that Job has very little to say in answer to God, especially when we think about how many words he expended earlier in the book. It just is vastly out of proportion for what Job has been saying. So this first discourse, though, God begins, and he's asking this series of rhetorical questions. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Who marked off its dimensions? Who stretched a measuring line across it? And he just goes through this series of rhetorical questions, and really in a way to give Job time to think and process, and to think about himself in relationship to God, and who God is in relationship to Job. And these questions will bring Job to a place where he can find himself in agreement with God and God's perspective. And so in a way, it's putting Job in his place and helping him to figure things out, but almost in a voyage of discovery kind of way. Instead of God coming in just forcing and saying, here's this, this, and this, and you should think this. It's more of asking questions that kind of guide him in that right path, that right line of thinking. In this first discourse, this first speech, God really spends a lot more time talking about his structure and maintenance of the world. So God as creator, who created the earth and who continues to govern it and sustain it. God talks about his management, his governing of the earth, from the big systems and elements of the earth down to the creatures. And he mentions different creatures and how they are sustained through God's actions in the world, and how he wisely and justly governs the world. We really get a sense as we read through Job 38 and 39 that God is ruling, and there's no part of the world that is outside of his governance, outside of his rule. And so he is presenting, but the way he's presenting this is through a series of questions. We started off with those, and it's like, what is the way to the place where the lightning is dispersed? He talks about, can you bring forth the constellations? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of water? Can you bring the rain? Can you make it rain even in the desert where there are no people? And do you know when the mountain goats give birth, and where the donkeys run free? And it just keeps going. And he kind of goes through, he talks about domesticated animals and wild animals. God's rule covers them all. So really encourage you to read through Job 38 and 39 and really think about all the different parts of the world that are mentioned, the different systems and elements and the different animals that are mentioned, and to see what God has to say about that. In fact, there is a video that I linked in our Sunday school teacher's guide this week that is a reading of Job 38, 39 through 40 verse 5. And it has scenes, nature scenes going along with it, kind of an illustrating. So there's different parts where there's animals when they're mentioned here that they appear on the screen. And it's very interesting and thought-provoking. So I encourage you to check that out. You can check with your Sunday school teacher. And we might actually link it below. We'll see if that's possible. But it's just a really interesting way of kind of putting this whole first part of the speech in perspective. And so we get to chapter 40, and we see God addressing Job again directly. So he started in 38 addressing Job directly, and then again in chapter 40, we see him addressing Job directly again. In verse 2, will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him. And so he's asking Job, calling on Job to answer. And so we see in this section that Job, the one who has been questioning God and asking all of these things, has become the one who is being questioned. And so we get Job's first response. So I'm going to go ahead and read Job's response, and then we're going to talk about it, and then we'll read the next section. So Job responds in chapter 40, verses 4 and 5. It says, I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. And so Job responds to God after this first discourse. And it's really brief. I mean, it's 2 verses long. And like we said, Job has been very wordy and lengthy in most of what he has to say. And I get a sense when I'm reading this that he's just very overwhelmed at this point. I mean, here he's been asking for God to speak and to interact with him. And then here God is, and he's living out what he has hoped for, and he's just overwhelmed. Perhaps maybe being overwhelmed by his insignificance in comparison to God's grandeur and majesty. And here he's saying he's unworthy. How can I reply? And putting a hand over his mouth, saying he's not going to add anything to what he has already said. I spoke once, I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. So he doesn't want to add anything to what he has already said up to this point. We talked about his vow of innocence that he said, he speaks, and that's before all of the Elihu speeches that we talked about last week. And Job doesn't have anything else that he wants to add. He said what he wants, and now he's being confronted with the God that he was asking for. And here we have God interacting with him. So here we're going to pick up in verse 6. And I'm going to read 6 through 14. And then we're going to talk about those verses. And then we'll kind of summarize the rest of what God has to say. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? Do you have an arm like God's? And can your voice thunder like his? Then adorn yourself with glory and splendor, and clothe yourself in honor and majesty. Unleash the fury of your wrath. Look at all who are proud and bring them low. Look at all who are proud and humble them. Crush the wicked where they stand. Bury them all in the dust together. Shroud their faces in the grave. Then I myself will admit to you that your own right hand can save you. And so once again, God is addressing Job with rhetorical questions. And here we really get a sense of God addressing Job's questions about God being just and governing justly. And he is really pointing out to Job, like, hey, you've been flirting with this line that is, if you were to continue down this path, that's going to set yourself up as more righteous than God, or it's like this sense of pride. You're flirting with it. He doesn't condemn what Job has done. He doesn't condemn Job's questions. He doesn't condemn Job's searching, but he's saying, hey, if you continue down this path, you're going to end up over here discrediting God's justice and elevating yourself above me. And so God is asking, and the way God does this though, is he's asking Job to exercise authority and judge all of the wicked and the proud, and to bring destruction on those who are doing wrong. And but Job can't deliver himself, and he can't, because he can't put himself in the place of God, and we know he can't deliver himself. And so that's what we get as we read through this passage. God is the one with the power to judge and to govern rightly and to move in the ways that we know God moves. He's the one who has the voice that can thunder and can adorn himself with glory and splendor and clothe himself in honor and majesty. Not humans, not Job. And he's the one who can judge those who are proud and the wicked and punish them for their wrongdoing. So we really get this sense then that God is reminding Job of his place, reminding him and trying to motivate him through a series of questions to surrender his complaint and to bring himself in line with what God is doing and how God is at work in the world. And he's given him an opportunity to be reined back in. And also, as we read through this section, we get a sense that God is reminding Job that the basis for a relationship with God, and we'll probably talk about this some next week too, is about responding to God rightly, not based on wealth and health. It's about responding to God rightly and having this relationship. And Job is the one that's going to have to decide, does he want to live in this world governed by God and not be able to be in charge of his own, of the world that he is in? Or does he want God to be in charge of that? And Job has to decide. God doesn't force him to. So as we continue on from our passage for this week, God's going to close his speech, and he brings up two creatures, the behemoth and Leviathan, and asks, kind of challenges Job to defeat them. These two huge creatures who are mythical creatures, but a lot of times behemoth could be associated with like a hippopotamus, and Leviathan could be associated with a crocodile. Although when I was reading through this, it sounded very much like a dragon, and I think dragons are super cool. But that's just for me. That's not from anything I read this week. But you have these mythical creatures, or even these real, if you want to base it on a hippopotamus and a crocodile, these creatures that are very hard to bring down. And God is saying, hey, you could defeat these. And so that's kind of how he closes out his speech, is going through these and saying that nothing on earth is its equal. It looks down on all that are haughty. It is king over all that are proud. Talking about Leviathan being that, and saying, hey, Job, can you bring those down? Can you do that? And I mean, with the answer being no, he can't. And so that's where God leaves it. And that's the end of chapter 41. And that's all that God has to say. We're kind of left hanging. And then we get Job's response. And we'll talk through that next week in more detail. But it kind of just leaves us dangling right there with what's going to happen. How's Job going to respond to God? I mean, how do you respond to God? I mean, God is responding to Job's suffering by pointing out his sovereignty and talking about how he created the world and how he governs it justly, and reminds Job that true justice is rooted in God and God's rule of the world. And that even though Job is living in a world where God allowed him to go through suffering, he is still just and holy and sovereign. And does Job want to live in that world or not? That's the question Job is left with. And I think that ultimately that's the question we have to wrestle with. Well, God is just and he governs the world. He is sovereign, but he's also love, and he loves us. And I think that's one of the things that I take away from this speech. I mean, God's not saying, oh, Job, I love you, but by him talking about who he is and presenting himself as creator, and by engaging Job in this dialogue at all, he is just showing how much he does care for his people and how much he does love us. I mean, God is God. He is so holy, and other than us, he could just wipe us off the face of the planet, but he doesn't. Instead, he chooses to have a relationship with us. And he lets Job ask some really hard questions. And he lets Job say some really hard things about God and ask some really hard things about God's work in the world. And yet he doesn't condemn him for asking those questions, but he does move him along the path towards responding to God rightly and seeing more from God's perspective, and reminding him, hey, like, this is what's going on. I am God. You're not God. You don't have my perspective. And he kind of reins him back in. He doesn't just outright condemn him and say, you should think this instead. He moves him down a path and works with Job where he is, meets him where he is, and walks with him through it. And that is something that is so awesome and motivates me to keep coming back and spending time with God and getting to know him more and more, because he always surprises me. And I know that he is with me no matter what I'm going through, whether it's a hard time or it's a good time or it's just a mediocre meh time. And I know that, and I hope that's your experience. And if it's not, I'd love to talk to you more about that. And you can contact me by calling the church. And I would love to talk to you about that. Any of us would. But God is awesome, and he is amazing, and his majesty and his glory are astounding. And when I think about that, and I think about the fact that he loves me, I'm just overwhelmed and I'm in awe. And I think that's, if I were going to just say what I think Job is feeling, I think that's probably how he's feeling at the end of this, going, whoa, I thought I knew who God was, but now I'm like getting a better picture, and I really know. And that's pretty awesome. And that's overwhelming all at once. So I just hope this has been an interesting study for you. Next week, we are going to wrap up our study of Job. We're not done with our summer study, but we are done with the Job part of it. So we have one more week in Job, and then we'll launch into Ecclesiastes in a few weeks. Thanks for joining me today. I'll talk to you next week. Bye.